219.9 meters of hull slides away from a shipyard on China's eastern coast. 16 decks stacked inside it. Room for 9,200 cars in a single voyage. That's more vehicles than some countries import in a month, moving on one ship. And the company that owns it doesn't build ships, doesn't run a shipping line, and 3 years earlier didn't own a single vessel of any kind. It's a car company. Its name is BYD, and by the time this ship, the BYD Shenzhen, finished its first crossing, 7 more just like it were already on the water, each one flying the company's own colors instead of a shipping line's. Look closer at where these ships have actually been calling though, and the pattern turns strange. Full going out, empty coming back, almost every time. There's a mechanical reason this fleet exists that almost nobody outside heavy shipping knows, and there's a real problem sitting in the return leg of every one of these voyages. Both of those threads matter, and we're getting to both. These breakdowns take real digging through shipping data and trade filings to put together, so if that's useful to you, hit subscribe and tap the bell so you don't miss the next one. Where are you watching this from? Drop your city in the comments. I read all of them. Let's orient ourselves here before we get into this. For most of the last century, moving cars across oceans wasn't a business car companies ran themselves. It was run by a small club of ship owners, mostly Japanese, Norwegian, and South Korean, names like NYK Line, Mitsui OSK, Wallenius Wilhelmsen, and Höegh Autoliners, who built and operated fleets of purpose made roll-on roll-off ships, vessels with ramps instead of cranes, decks that fold up and down like a parking garage turned sideways. Toyota and Nissan grew their own shipping arms over decades of steady exports. Nearly everyone else, including most Western automakers, rented space on someone else's ship and paid whatever the market demanded that quarter. That arrangement held up fine as long as demand for ocean space stayed roughly flat, and for most of the 2000s it did. Chinese car exports were a footnote in that system. As recently as 2024, ships controlled by Chinese owners made up a sliver of global car carrying capacity, well under 3% by most industry counts, according to shipping analytics firm Veasan Nautical, which meant Chinese automakers were guests in someone else's fleet, booking space months in advance and taking whatever price they were handed. Whoever controls movement sets the price of everything that moves, and for decades, the people who controlled movement weren't the people building the cars. That gap between who makes a product and who ships it is old news in global trade. Oil companies learned it with tankers. Grain traders learned it with bulk carriers. The lesson repeats itself. The party that owns the hull collects the toll, and the party that only owns the cargo pays it, no matter how good that cargo is. By 2022, that gap turned into an emergency. China's total vehicle exports hit 5.86 million units in 2024 alone, up over 19% from the year before. And BYD's own overseas sales jumped from roughly 243,000 vehicles in 2023 to over 417,000 in 2024, a rise of nearly 72% in a single year. The company was targeting 800,000 to 1 million overseas deliveries for 2025, with a target north of 1.5 million for 2026. Every one of those cars needed a berth on a ship, and there weren't enough ships. Elon Musk said as much publicly in October of 2022, telling investors Tesla had missed its own delivery numbers because, in his words, there weren't enough boats, there weren't enough trains, there weren't enough car carriers. He was describing a market where demand for ocean-going car capacity had exploded while the fleet serving it had barely grown, because ship owners had gone nearly a decade without ordering new vessels after the 2008 financial crisis gutted the segment. The math that followed was brutal. Daily charter rates for a mid-sized car carrier sat around $17,000 a day before the pandemic. By 2023, that same class of ship was fixing above $110,000 a day, roughly a 6-fold jump in 3 years, on a cost line every exporter has to pay no matter how good their product is. Renting a single ship for 1 month at those rates could run past $4 million. For a company planning to move 1 million cars a year, that isn't a line item. That's an existential cost. BYD ran the numbers and concluded that owning ships outright, even at a steep upfront price, would end up cheaper than renting capacity in a market this tight. In 2022, the company committed roughly 5 billion yuan, about $687 million, to build an 8-ship fleet, betting that per-vehicle shipping costs would drop by 30 to 40% once it stopped paying someone else's market rate. By the company's own estimate, that adds up to close to $1.4 billion saved every year once the fleet runs at full tilt. That's a substantial number, and it explains why a car company decided the fastest fix for a shipping problem was to stop being a shipping customer altogether. The ship that solved this is worth pausing on, because the engineering shows how seriously BYD took the bet. In the shipping industry, these vessels are called PCTCs, pure car and truck carriers, and capacity is measured in something called a CEU, a car equivalent unit, roughly the deck space one standard sedan takes up. The Shenzhen is rated at 9,200 CEU, which made it the largest car carrier on the planet when it entered service in 2025, edging out a Norwegian rival by about 100 vehicle slots. It runs on dual-fuel technology, able to burn either liquefied natural gas or conventional marine fuel, paired with a boil-off gas recondenser that recaptures vapor instead of venting it, a 1-megawatt hybrid battery system, and a high-voltage shore power connection that lets the ship run on electricity instead of its engines while docked, cutting emissions to zero during port calls. The hull carries drag-reducing, anti-fouling coatings to cut fuel burn on long crossings. None of that is decoration. A ship that size, moving that much cargo, burns through fuel and port fees fast enough that a few percentage points of efficiency add up to real money across a 15,000-kilometer round trip. The whole fleet was built inside China, at China Merchants Jinling Shipyard, China Merchants Heavy Industry, Guangzhou Shipyard International, and CIMC Raffles, which meant the entire order stayed inside the same industrial base that also happens to own port infrastructure. That overlap matters more than it sounds. Shenzhen Port Group signed a formal cooperation agreement with BYD in 2025, setting aside dedicated storage yards, priority berths, and expedited customs clearance specifically for BYD's vehicles at Shenzhen's Xiaomo terminal, which now runs 12 international shipping routes covering Europe, the Middle East, Southeast Asia, South America, Africa, and Australia. A separate 3.3 billion yuan terminal project is under construction at Shanwei, built specifically to serve BYD's manufacturing park nearby. This is the real mechanism behind the idea of a company taking over ports. Nobody bought a port outright, not in the way the phrase implies. What happened instead is a car company got its own dedicated lanes, berths, and customs channels carved out of ports that are themselves largely run by Chinese state-linked operators, the same conglomerates that built the ships in the first place. That's a quieter form of control than owning a terminal on paper, and in some ways a more durable one. Here's the crack in the plan, and it circles back to what we flagged at the start. Ships in this fleet keep showing the same pattern on tracking data. The Explorer No. 1, the Hefei, and the Shenzhen, all called at Brazilian ports in the first half of 2025, arrived stacked with new energy vehicles and left completely empty, racing to beat a tariff hike Brazil had scheduled on imported EVs. An empty return leg isn't a rounding error in shipping economics. It's half a voyage earning nothing. A chartered ship is a favor. You can hand it back the moment the market turns against you. An owned ship is a fact. You carry the fixed cost of crew, fuel, and maintenance, whether the return hold is full or not. And right now, on BYD's own routes, it usually isn't. Layer a second problem on top of that. Charter rates, the very crisis that justified building this fleet, have already started sliding back down from that peak above $110,000 a day toward the $47,000 to $50,000 range by late 2025, as the wave of new ships ordered across the whole industry, not just by BYD, finally hit the water. The shortage that made ownership look like genius in 2022 is easing in 2026, and a fleet sized for 1 million vehicle years of exports only pays for itself if that export growth keeps showing up on schedule. In markets that keep their tariff doors open, Electriv, a German trade outlet that covers the EV industry closely, has flagged the obvious downside directly. 8 owned ships is a lot of fixed cost to be carrying if overseas demand growth doesn't keep pace, and tariffs in the United States, the European Union, and now Brazil keep moving that target. In my opinion, as someone who spent years watching bets like this play out in maritime logistics, owning your own fleet is still the right long-term move for a company shipping 1 million cars a year. The alternative, staying dependent on a chartered market that gave Chinese automakers a sliver of global capacity for decades, is worse. But correct in the long run and comfortable in the short run are different things. And right now, BYD is carrying 8 fixed-cost assets built for a growth curve that policymakers on 3 continents have already shown they're willing to interrupt. The ships are real. The dedicated berths are real. The empty holds heading back to China are also real, and that's the part of this story, the highlight reel skips. So is this the smartest vertical integration move in the car industry this decade, or a billion-dollar bet on export growth that hasn't fully shown up yet? I lean toward the first, with real risk attached. Tell me where you land in the comments, because I read every one of them. Until next time, subscribe if you want the next breakdown in your feed. Tap that bell so you catch it, and drop a comment. I read every single one.